The dining room at Blackwood Plantation breathed with heat, though all 12 windows stood open to the April evening. No breeze came. The air hung thick as molasses, carrying the scent of magnolia blossoms rotting on their branches, mixing with the smell of roasted meat and burning tallow. Delphine stood 3 feet behind Master Thaddeus Blackwood's chair, working the palmetto fan in steady, mechanical strokes that her shoulders had learned 8 years prior. Back and forth. Back and forth. The rhythm was supposed to be soothing, but tonight each sweep of woven palm felt like counting down to something she could not name. Her hands ached. She had been fanning since 4 o'clock, when the master had retired to dress for supper, and now the mantel clock showed 6:30. The brass handle of the fan had worn grooves into her palms over the years, permanent indentations that no amount of lye soap could scrub away. Tonight, she gripped it so tightly that her knuckles had gone white as the linen napkins folded into swans at each place setting. White as the master's collar. White as bone. She kept her eyes fixed on a point just above Master Blackwood's left shoulder, her gaze carefully vacant in the way that house slaves learn to perfect, present but unseeing, attentive but absent. It was a survival skill, this strategic blindness. But tonight, that careful emptiness kept sliding away from her like water through cupped hands. Tonight, her eyes wanted to drift 3 chairs down the table to where Cyrus Whitmore sat, sprawled in his seat like a pig at a trough, already working on his second glass of bourbon though supper had not yet been served. The overseer had arrived an hour ago, bringing with him the stench of the fields, red clay and sweat and something else, something that clung to men who spent their days inflicting pain. Tobacco juice stained the corners of his mouth, and when he smiled, which he did often and without warmth, his teeth showed yellow and uneven. He was a large man, not tall but broad, with shoulders made thick from swinging a whip and hands that looked like slabs of raw beef. His face was weathered to the color and texture of saddle leather, his eyes a pale, watery blue that reminded Delphine of skim milk left too long in the sun. Master Blackwood had invited him, as he did every 3rd Sunday. The master believed it built loyalty, breaking bread with his overseer, treating him as something approaching an equal within these walls even as the social distance between plantation owner and hired brutality remained carefully maintained. Thaddeus Blackwood was a slight man, thin-lipped and meticulous, who wore his wealth in the stiffness of his posture and the precise trimming of his silver beard. He sat at the head of the table with his hands folded, waiting for his wife and son to finish their preparations, waiting for the ritual to begin. At the table's opposite end, Constance Blackwood adjusted a fork that did not need adjusting. The mistress was a woman whose beauty had curdled into something bitter, her face still handsome but hollowed out, as if something essential had been scooped from behind her eyes. She wore dove-gray silk that rustled when she moved, and her fingers, thin as bird bones, constantly worried at the lace of her sleeves. She never looked directly at the slaves who served her, but rather through them, as if they were no more substantial than the steam rising from the covered dishes. Beside her, 17-year-old Beauregard Blackwood sat with the careless confidence of inherited cruelty. He had his father's narrow face but his mother's dark eyes, and he watched the room with the calculating attention of a young man learning the mechanisms of power. His gaze lingered on Delphine sometimes, lingered too long, and she felt it like spider legs crawling across her skin. The pocket doors slid open, and Temperance entered carrying the soup tureen. Delphine's heart clenched. Her sister moved with the careful grace that 16 years had taught her, her head slightly bowed, her feet silent on the Persian rug. Temperance was beautiful in a way that made Delphine's stomach turn to stone with dread, high cheekbones and smooth dark skin, eyes like polished mahogany, a mouth that had not yet learned to hold itself hard against the world. She wore a simple gray dress with a white apron, both spotless, both pressed with painful precision. One stray thread, one spot of grease, one tiny imperfection could mean the strap. Delphine watched her sister set the tureen on the sideboard, watched her lift the ladle with both hands. The silver caught the candlelight, throwing dancing reflections across the wallpaper, a pattern of vines and roses that seemed to writhe in the flickering glow. Temperance moved to Master Blackwood first, as was proper, and ladled the turtle soup into his bowl without spilling a single drop. "Smells fine," Master Blackwood said to no one in particular. He did not look at Temperance. Temperance moved around the table, to Constance, then to Beauregard. Each time the ladle dipped and rose, each time the soup poured in a smooth amber stream. The tremor in Delphine's hands grew worse. She could feel it traveling up her arms, a vibration that started in her bones and worked outward. Back and forth with the fan. Back and forth. When Temperance reached Cyrus Whitmore, he did not move his arms from where they rested on the table. He sat with his elbows spread wide, taking up space, his thick fingers drumming against the mahogany. Temperance had to lean across him to reach his bowl. "Well now," Whitmore said, his voice like gravel scraping across wood. "Ain't this a picture?" Temperance said nothing. The rules were absolute. House slaves did not speak unless spoken to directly with a question, and even then, answers were to be brief as breath. She concentrated on the ladle, on keeping her hands steady. Whitmore's eyes crawled over her. Delphine could see it from where she stood, could see the way his gaze moved across her sister's face, down her neck, lingering on the curve of her shoulder where it met her collarbone. Something cold and sharp lodged itself beneath Delphine's ribs. "You're filling out real nice," Whitmore continued, as if commenting on the weather. "Ain't she, Master Blackwood? This little gal's blooming like a flower." Master Blackwood made a noncommittal sound in his throat. Constance Blackwood became very interested in her napkin. The soup began to pour. Temperance's hand shook slightly, not enough for the white folks to notice, but Delphine saw it. She saw everything. She saw the way Temperance's jaw tightened, saw the way her sister's breath had gone shallow. Whitmore's left hand came up, casual as anything, and wrapped around Temperance's wrist. The world contracted. The dining room, with its high ceilings and crystal chandelier, with its paintings of long-dead Blackwood staring down from the walls, with its heavy curtains and polished silver, all of it telescoped down to that single point of contact. Thick, scarred fingers encircling the delicate bones of Temperance's wrist. The soup ladle trembled, suspended in air. "Soft," Whitmore said, his thumb pressing into the tender underside of her arm. "Real soft hands for a house gal." Temperance froze. Delphine stopped fanning. The palmetto blades hung motionless in the dead air. "Whitmore," Master Blackwood said, his tone carrying a hint of reproach, but mild, so mild. The reproach a man might use for a dog begging at the table, discouraged but not forbidden. The overseer released Temperance's wrist with a wet chuckle. "Just admiring the help, Thaddeus. No harm in looking." Temperance completed pouring the soup. A single drop struck the tablecloth beside Whitmore's bowl, brown against white, spreading slowly into the linen like a bloodstain. She stepped back, returning to her station by the sideboard, and Delphine could see her sister's chest rising and falling too quickly, could see the way Temperance's free hand clenched in the folds of her apron. Something inside Delphine cracked. Not broke, not yet. But cracked, like ice on a pond in late winter, that sound of fracturing that comes before the fall. "Shall we say grace?" Constance Blackwood's voice was thin, reedy, desperate to restore the veneer of civilization. Master Blackwood bowed his head. The others followed. Delphine lowered her eyes but did not close them. Through her lashes, she watched. "Heavenly Father," Master Blackwood intoned, "we thank thee for thy bounty. For this food before us, for this house and land, for the natural order thou hast ordained. We thank thee for the Sabbath, for this day of rest and reflection. Bless this meal and those gathered here. Guide us in righteousness. Amen." "Amen," the others echoed. Delphine's lips did not move. The meal began. Beauregard lifted his spoon. Constance dabbed at her mouth with her napkin before tasting the soup. Master Blackwood ate with small, precise movements. Whitmore slurped, his mouth wet and loud. "Fine soup," he declared. "You keep a good kitchen, Thaddeus." "Ruth does well enough," Master Blackwood agreed. Delphine resumed fanning, though her rhythm had faltered. Back and forth. Back and forth. But now her eyes drifted, as if pulled by some gravity she could not resist. They moved past the faces at the table, past the crystal glasses and china plates, past the silver candlesticks with their dripping wax. They settled on the carving station. There, on a serving cart beside the sideboard, sat the evening's main course, a roasted lamb, browned and steaming, studded with rosemary and garlic. The meat glistened with rendered fat in the candlelight. And beside it, arranged with careful precision on a linen cloth, lay the carving implements. A long knife, its blade keen enough to catch and throw back the light. A two-pronged fork, its tines sharp as needles. A smaller knife for boning. All of them polished to a mirror shine, all of them waiting. Delphine stared at those silver implements, and for the first time in 8 years of standing behind Master Blackwood's chair, fanning through countless suppers and dinners and social gatherings, she forgot to maintain her vacant expression. Her face showed something. Her eyes showed something. The carving fork gleamed like a promise. Whitmore laughed at something Beauregard had said, his voice booming through the dining room, and Delphine's fingers tightened around the fan handle until she thought it might snap. The tines of that fork were each 3 inches long. Sharp enough to pierce. Sharp enough to puncture. Sharp enough to take. The heat pressed down. The candles flickered. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed the quarter hour. Delphine stood behind Master Blackwood's chair, fanning, her white-knuckled hands trembling, her eyes fixed on silver that promised steel that promised blood, while at the table, Cyrus Whitmore ate his soup and smiled. If you're drawn into this dark tale of vengeance and horror, subscribe to journey deeper into these macabre histories. Leave a comment telling me, what would you have done in Delphine's place? The soup course ended. Temperance moved forward to collect the bowls, her movements controlled, her face a mask that Delphine recognized as her own reflection, the careful absence of expression that was itself an expression of survival. As her sister leaned across the table to retrieve Master Blackwood's bowl, Delphine's mind slipped sideways, pulled down into memory like a body sinking beneath dark water. 3 weeks ago. The carriage house on a Thursday afternoon. Delphine had been beating rugs in the side yard when she heard the screams. Not the kind of screams that came from the fields during punishment, those were expected, rhythmic, part of the plantation's terrible music. These were different. Higher. Desperate. They came from inside the carriage house where Whitmore kept his private office, the place where he conducted the intimate business of breaking spirits. She had dropped the rug beater and run, though running toward those sounds was against every instinct of self-preservation she possessed. The carriage house door stood half open. Inside, Whitmore had Temperance bent over his desk, one hand twisted in her hair, the other holding his whip. Her dress was torn at the shoulder. "Told you to look at me when I speak to you, gal," Whitmore was saying, his voice almost conversational. "That ain't too much to ask, is it? Just a little respect for your betters." Temperance's face was turned to the side, tears streaming down her cheeks, but her jaw was set. Even terrified, even in pain, she had turned her face away from him. That small rebellion, that tiny assertion of self, had cost her. The whip came down. Once. Twice. 3 times. The sound of leather on flesh was like wet cloth being torn. Temperance stopped screaming after the 4th lash, not because the pain had lessened, but because she had retreated somewhere inside herself, somewhere he could not reach. Delphine had frozen in the doorway, her hands gripping the frame so hard that splinters drove into her palms. She could not move. Could not speak. Could not intervene. To do so would mean her own destruction, and then who would be left to care for Temperance? Who would be left to remember? So she stood there, bearing witness, adding this atrocity to the catalogue of atrocities that lived inside her like a second skeleton made of shame and rage. When Whitmore finally finished, when he had coiled his whip and straightened his shirt, he had noticed Delphine in the doorway. He smiled at her, that yellow-toothed smile, and said, "Your little sister's got spirit. That's good. I like spirit. Makes the breaking sweeter." Temperance had been unconscious. Delphine had carried her back to their cabin behind the kitchen house, had laid her on the straw tick mattress, had cleaned the wounds with water and what little whiskey she could steal from the master's study. The scars were still there, raised welts across Temperance's back that would never fully fade. That night, Temperance had gripped Delphine's hand and whispered, "I won't let him see me afraid. I won't give him that." But fear was not something you could refuse to give. Fear was taken. The memory released Delphine, and she found herself back in the dining room, the fan moving in her hands though she did not remember resuming the motion. Temperance was at the sideboard now, preparing the next course. Safe, for the moment. Visible. Delphine needed her to stay visible. At the table, Master Blackwood was discussing the war. Fort Sumter had fallen 3 weeks prior, and Mississippi had seceded in January. The Confederacy was a newborn thing, raw and squalling, and men like Thaddeus Blackwood spoke of it with religious fervor. "Lincoln is a tyrant," Master Blackwood declared, dabbing at his mouth with his napkin. "He would see our entire way of life destroyed. Our property was confiscated. Our sovereignty was trampled." Property, Delphine thought, the word bitter as gall in her mind. He means us. We are the property he fears to lose. Whitmore nodded, reaching for his bourbon. War's coming right enough. But Mississippi boys'll make short work of them Yankees. Northern men ain't got the stomach for real fighting. Beauregard leaned forward, his eyes bright with boyish enthusiasm. Father, you'll let me enlist when I turn 18? Captain Pemberton is raising a company. We'll discuss it when the time comes, Master Blackwood interrupted, but there was pride in his voice. Pride in his son's eagerness to kill and die for the right to own human flesh. Constance Blackwood said nothing. She never did, not about anything that mattered. She existed in a fog of laudanum and willful ignorance, a ghost haunting her own house. Delphine had seen her, late at night, standing at the window of her bedroom, staring out at nothing, her hands fluttering at her throat like trapped birds. Whatever Constance Blackwood had been before she married into this family, before she became mistress of this house of horrors, that woman was gone. What remained was a hollow thing that breathed and ate and looked away from every terrible truth. Temperance approached the table carrying a platter of roasted quail, arranged on a bed of wild rice and collard greens. The smell should have been appetizing. Ruth was an exceptional cook, had to be, her value depending on her ability to satisfy white palates, but to Delphine, everything smelled like ash and copper. As Temperance set the platter before Master Blackwood, Whitmore's gaze followed her movements with the focused attention of a snake watching a mouse. He was always watching. Calculating. Planning. That little gal works hard, Whitmore observed, his words slightly slurred from the bourbon. Real devoted to her duties. Master Blackwood began carving the quail, his movements precise. The house servants are well trained. I pride myself on maintaining discipline without excessive harshness. Excessive harshness. Delphine's mind snagged on the words. What was excessive? Where was the line? 10 lashes or 20? Families torn apart once a year or twice? Children sold at 5 years old or 10? Another memory surfaced, this one older, sharper. 2 months ago. The day Marcus was taken. Marcus had been her husband in the way that slaves could be married, no legal sanction, no written record, just a promise made between two people who had nothing to promise except themselves. They had jumped the broom 5 years ago, with old Josiah presiding and Ruth providing a cake made from hoarded sugar and dried apples. For 5 years, Marcus had been the thing that made life bearable, the person whose presence reminded her that she was still human, still capable of love, still more than the sum of her labor. Marcus worked in the stables, tending the horses that Master Blackwood prized almost as much as his land. He was gentle with the animals, firm but never cruel, and the horses trusted him in a way they trusted no one else. He was also protective of Delphine, which was both beautiful and dangerous. The day it happened, Delphine had been in the summer kitchen, helping Ruth prepare preserves. Whitmore had come looking for her, and had found her alone in the pantry counting jars. He had backed her into a corner, his body blocking the door, his breath hot and rank on her face. "You're a handsome woman, Delphine," he had said, his hand reaching for her waist. "Ain't right, keeping all that beauty to yourself." She had frozen, as she always froze, her mind splitting in two, one part racing through possible responses and their consequences, the other part fleeing to that internal space where the body might be touched but the self remained inviolate. Marcus had come looking for her. Had seen through the pantry door. Had pulled Whitmore away with a roar that came from someplace deeper than thought. "Don't you touch her," Marcus had shouted, his hands fisted in Whitmore's shirt. "Don't you ever touch her." For a moment, the world had hung suspended. A black man's hands on a white man's body. The ultimate transgression. The unforgivable sin. Whitmore had smiled. Actually smiled. "Well now. We have a problem." By sunset, Marcus had been sold. $40 to a buyer from Louisiana, a man who ran a cotton plantation where the work was so brutal that slaves rarely lasted more than 5 years. Master Blackwood had signed the papers without a second thought. Property that raised its hand against white authority could not be tolerated, even if that authority was merely hired rather than landed. Delphine had not been allowed to say goodbye. The last she saw of Marcus was his back as he was led away in chains, his head turned toward her, his mouth forming words she could not hear. That night, she had discovered she was pregnant. 2 weeks later, she had miscarried, her body rejecting the promise of future life in this place where no future was possible. She had bled alone in a cabin, old Josiah slipping her rags and feverfew tea, Ruth holding her hand and humming songs that were old when their grandmothers were young. No one mentioned it. No one spoke Marcus's name. He simply ceased to exist within the boundaries of Blackwood Plantation, edited out of their lives as easily as a line crossed through in a ledger book. But Delphine remembered. She remembered everything. Her memory was a tomb she carried inside her chest, filled with the bodies of every small death and large death she had witnessed, every humiliation, every cruelty, every moment of forced silence. The weight of witnessing was its own kind of torture. "More wine," Master Blackwood said, holding up his glass without looking. Delphine moved forward, lifting the decanter from the sideboard. Her hands were steadier now, or perhaps she had simply moved beyond trembling into some other state, a stillness that was not calm but rather the absolute quiet that precedes a storm. She poured, the ruby liquid catching the candlelight as it fell. Master Blackwood's fingers, she noticed, were soft and uncalloused. Gentleman's hands. Hands that had never swung a whip personally but had signed the orders for countless whippings. Hands that had never worked a day of hard labor but had profited from the labor of hundreds. Clean hands, covered in blood invisible to their owner. Whitmore was telling a story now, his voice rising with drink and enthusiasm. "Had me a troublesome buck 3 weeks back," he said, cutting into his quail with unnecessary force. "Big fellow, thought he was clever. Kept slowing down in the fields, claiming exhaustion. Too tired, Mr. Whitmore, sir," he mimicked in a high, mocking voice. "So I said to him, you want to rest? I'll give you rest." Beauregard leaned forward, fascinated. Even Constance paused in her mechanical eating. "Strung him up by his thumbs from the barn rafter," Whitmore continued, sawing at his meat. "Left him there in the heat for 6 hours. Every time he passed out, had old Samuel throw a bucket of water on him to bring him around. He laughed, a wet, phlegmy sound. By the time I cut him down, his shoulders were dislocated. Both of them. He shoveled quail into his mouth, chewed, swallowed. Ain't had a problem with his work pace since." "Effective," Master Blackwood murmured, sipping his wine. "Effective. Clinical. A solution to a problem." The fact that the problem was a human being in agony, that the solution involved torture, that the entire scenario was predicated on one man's ownership of another man's body, these things were not worthy of discussion. They were simply the natural order, ordained by God and law. Delphine's vision narrowed. The room seemed to pulse with each beat of her heart. She could hear Whitmore's jaw working, the wet sounds of his chewing, the click of his teeth. She could smell him, sweat and tobacco and bourbon and something else, something rotten beneath. She could see his hands, those thick, scarred hands that had dislocated shoulders and torn flesh and touched her sister's wrist. Those hands were reaching for his wine glass now, fingers closing around the crystal stem. He lifted it, tilted it to his lips. His throat worked as he swallowed. The flesh there looked soft, vulnerable. The carving implements still lay beside the lamb. The forks 2 tines caught and threw back the candlelight, sharp as promises, bright as vengeance. "Tell me, Whitmore," Master Blackwood said, gesturing with his own fork, "do you think the Yankees will attempt a naval blockade? My factor in New Orleans writes that." But Delphine was no longer listening. She had moved beyond listening, beyond the careful attention to white voices that her survival had always demanded. She stood behind Master Blackwood's chair, the fan moving in mechanical rhythm, her eyes fixed on those silver implements, and inside her chest, something was gathering. Something that had been building for 28 years, for every indignity and violation, for every loss and grief, for Marcus and for the child she had carried and lost, for Temperance and for the horror that waited for her sister in Cyrus Whitmore's future plans. The weight of witnessing had become unbearable. The tomb she carried inside herself was full to bursting with the bodies of the dead and the ghosts of the living who had died inside without their hearts stopping. Something was going to break. Something was going to shatter. The only question was what? Whitmore set down his wine glass and belched, loud and crude. "Pardon," he said, though his tone suggested he was anything but sorry. His pale eyes drifted toward the sideboard where Temperance stood, and his smile widened. Delphine's hands tightened on the fan handle. The candles flickered. The clock ticked. And in the gathering darkness behind her eyes, Delphine began to understand that witnessing was not enough. That memory was not enough. That survival was not enough. That sometimes, the only response to horror was horror answered with horror. The thought came to her clear and cold and certain, like a key turning in a lock she had not known existed. Soon. The quail was reduced to bones on fine china, the collard greens consumed, the wild rice scraped clean from serving platters. Temperance and old Josiah moved through the room like shadows, clearing plates, refilling glasses, their presence necessary but unacknowledged, furniture that breathed. Delphine continued her fanning, though the evening had grown no cooler. If anything, the heat had intensified, pressing down on the room like a hand on a throat. Master Blackwood pushed back slightly from the table, satisfied. He patted his lips with his napkin and folded it with geometric precision, placing it beside his empty plate. "Constance, my dear, Ruth has outdone herself this evening." Constance Blackwood's smile was thin as paper. "Yes. Quite satisfactory." Satisfactory. The word hung in the air like smoke. Nothing in this house was ever praised, never celebrated. It was merely adequate or it was punished. There existed no middle ground, no space for simple human appreciation. Every meal, every pressed shirt, every polished floor was simply expected, the baseline requirement of their captivity. Whitmore loosened his collar, his thick fingers struggling with the button. His face had gone ruddy with drink and rich food, sweat beading at his hairline despite Delphine's constant fanning. He had consumed nearly half a bottle of bourbon, and his movements had grown looser, more careless. Drunk men were dangerous men. Drunk men said things they might otherwise keep locked behind their teeth. "Speaking of satisfactory," Whitmore said, his words sliding together slightly, "I was meaning to discuss a business matter with you, Thaddeus." Master Blackwood raised an eyebrow, reaching for his brandy snifter. The dessert course was yet to come, Ruth's famous chess pie, served with fresh cream, but he was in no hurry. Sunday suppers were meant to be leisurely affairs, drawn-out performances of gentility and grace. "Business on the Sabbath, Cyrus? That seems rather gauche. Won't take but a minute." Whitmore shifted in his chair, his gaze drifting once more to where Temperance stood by the sideboard, her hands clasped before her, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Been thinking about my living situation. That room above the stable ain't fitting for a man in my position. I need someone to keep a proper house for me. Someone to cook and clean and tend to domestic matters." The room seemed to contract. Delphine's hands stopped moving. The fan hung suspended in dead air. Master Blackwood swirled his brandy, studying the amber liquid. "You're suggesting I provide you with additional household help? We could perhaps arrange for one of the field women to—" "Not looking for field stock," Whitmore interrupted, his voice taking on an edge beneath the bourbon blur. "Need someone with refinement. Someone already trained in household duties." His eyes locked onto Temperance, and his meaning hung in the air like a noose. "Someone like that young gal there." The words landed in Delphine's chest like a fist. The world tilted sideways, and for a moment, she thought she might fall, might simply collapse onto the Persian rug and never rise again. But her body remained upright, remained in position, even as her mind screamed. Temperance had gone absolutely still. Not the stillness of calm, but the frozen rigidity of a rabbit that has caught sight of the hawk's shadow. Her breathing had stopped. Delphine could see it, could see her sister holding herself in perfect, terrible suspension. Master Blackwood frowned slightly. "Temperance is a house servant. Her duties here are. I'll buy her." Whitmore's voice was flat now, businesslike. $500. That's more than fair for a young gal, even one with house training. $500. The price of her sister's body, her sister's future, her sister's soul. Spoken aloud like the cost of a horse or a plot of land. Delphine's vision swam. The candlelight became a smear of yellow across the darkness gathering at the edges of her sight. Beauregard's eyes darted between his father and the overseer, excitement flickering across his young face. This was business, the machinery of the world he was learning to inherit. Property in motion. Capital changing hands. Constance Blackwood's fork clattered to her plate. The sound was sharp, violent in the weighted silence. Everyone turned to look at her, and for once, there was something in her hollow face, not quite horror, not quite protest, but a flicker of the woman she might have been before this house had eaten her alive. "Thaddeus," she said, her voice thin but audible. "Perhaps we should." 500 is generous, Master Blackwood interrupted, not looking at his wife. He was looking at Whitmore, calculating. Numbers spun behind his eyes, the value of the girl against the cost of finding a replacement, the political advantage of keeping his overseer satisfied against the disruption to household routine. "She's young and healthy," Whitmore pressed, sensing weakness. "Good teeth, strong back. And she's pretty. That's worth something, ain't it?" He smiled, and there was nothing human in it. "I'll treat her real well. Give her her own room in the new quarters I'm building. She'll have it easier than most." Easier. The lie was so brazen, so obvious, that Delphine almost laughed. Almost. But laughter had died inside her years ago, strangled by the weight of witnessing too much truth. Everyone at the table knew what Whitmore meant. Everyone understood the true nature of his domestic arrangement. Temperance would not be a housekeeper. She would be a concubine, a slave in every sense but held even closer, trapped in isolation with a man who had already demonstrated his appetite for inflicting pain. And there was no law to stop him. No moral authority to which they might appeal. A white man could do as he pleased with his property. The only check on his behavior was his own conscience, and men like Cyrus Whitmore had long ago excised that useless organ. From her position by the sideboard, Temperance made a sound. Not quite a word, not quite a sob, something between the two, a noise that came from the place where language failed and animal terror took over. Her hands had come up to grip her arms, and she was shaking. Not trembling. Shaking. Her entire body vibrating with the force of suppressed panic. Delphine moved without thinking. She stepped forward, away from her position behind Master Blackwood's chair, breaking protocol. The fan slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor. Everyone turned to stare at her. "Master Blackwood," she heard herself say, and her voice sounded strange to her own ears, too calm, too level, as if coming from someone else's throat. "Please. She's just a child." The silence that followed was absolute. A slave did not speak unbidden. A slave certainly did not contradict or question a business arrangement between white men. Delphine had just committed an offense that could cost her everything, her position, her remaining privileges, possibly her life. Master Blackwood's face darkened. "You forget yourself, Delphine." "I know, sir." The words kept coming, pulled from some deep well of desperation. "But Temperance is skilled here, in this house. She knows your preferences, your routines. To replace her would be. That's enough." Master Blackwood's voice cracked like a whip. "Return to your position. Now." Delphine stood frozen. She should obey. Obedience was survival. Obedience was the only tool she possessed. But her feet would not move. Could not. Because if she stepped back, if she resumed her place behind the master's chair, if she picked up that fan and continued her mechanical rhythm, then she was accepting this. She was watching it happen. She was witnessing, again, always witnessing, never acting. The tomb inside her chest cracked open, and all the dead began to scream. Whitmore laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "Seems like the older ones got feelings about it. That's sweet. Real sweet." He leaned back in his chair, hooking his thumbs in his vest. "Tell you what, Thaddeus. Make it 400. I'll take that as a discount for the inconvenience of breaking in new help. $400. Her sister's price had just dropped by 100. Temperance was being bargained down like a damaged good, like something slightly defective, and with each reduction in price, her humanity was further erased. Master Blackwood hesitated. Delphine could see the calculation in his face, the weighing of options. $400 was a considerable sum. And Whitmore was valuable, a skilled overseer who kept the field hands productive and the discipline harsh. Satisfied overseers stayed. Dissatisfied overseers left, and finding a good replacement was difficult in these times of war and disruption. "Father." Beauregard's voice broke in, eager and young and cruel. "Mr. Whitmore's offer is more than fair. We can train another girl for house service. There are several in the quarters of appropriate age. Several of appropriate age. As if they were selecting fruit from a tree. As if Temperance was not standing 10 feet away, listening to her fate being decided like a business transaction, like a sale of livestock, like anything but the destruction of a human life. Constance Blackwood's mouth opened, closed. She looked at Temperance, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time, and something flickered in her laudanum-hazed eyes. But then she looked away, down at her hands, at the lace on her sleeves. She said nothing. She never did. Better to be complicit than to challenge the order of things. Better to be safe than to be right. The matter is settled, Master Blackwood declared. $400, Cyrus. We'll draw up the papers tomorrow. The words fell like stones into dark water, sending ripples through the room. Temperance made that sound again, that not quite sob, and her legs buckled. She caught herself against the sideboard, her knuckles going white against the mahogany, her breath coming in rapid, shallow gasps. Delphine felt something inside her snap. Not crack, snap. Clean and final, like a bone breaking. She had spent 28 years learning how to survive in this house of horror. 28 years perfecting the art of self-erasure, of strategic invisibility, of swallowing rage and grief and fear until her insides were a landscape of scar tissue. 28 years of witnessing atrocities and carrying the weight of them in silence, adding them to the tomb inside her chest. 28 years of waiting for someone to save her, save them, save any of them. But no one was coming. No one had ever been coming. There was no rescue, no divine intervention, no moment when the masters would suddenly recognize their slaves' humanity and release them from bondage. There was only this, the grinding machinery of ownership, the daily violence, the slow death of hope. And now they were taking Temperance. The last person she loved, the last reason she had to pretend that survival mattered. They were giving her to a man who would use her body until it broke, who would take pleasure in her pain, who would own not just her labor but her most intimate self. Delphine's eyes moved across the room. To Temperance, shaking by the sideboard. To Master Blackwood, satisfied with his business acumen. To Constance, already retreating back into her fog. To Beauregard, learning the lessons of ownership. To Cyrus Whitmore, his pale eyes fixed on his new acquisition with predatory satisfaction. And then her gaze fell to the serving cart. The roasted lamb sat there, partially carved. The meat had gone cold, congealing in its own fat. But the implements beside it remained, the long knife, the boning blade, the carving fork. The fork. 2 tines, each 3 inches long. Sharp enough to pierce tough meat, to separate flesh from bone. Sharp enough for other purposes. She looked at that fork, really looked at it, and something settled inside her. A terrible calm descended, cold and clear as winter water. She understood, suddenly, what was going to happen. Not might happen. It was going to happen. The future arranged itself before her with crystalline certainty. Whitmore was still talking, his words slurred and satisfied. I'll come by Tuesday to collect her. Give me time to get the room ready, make it nice and proper. He winked at Master Blackwood. Break her in gentle-like. The words were meant to be reassuring. They were obscene. Delphine walked to the serving cart. Her movements were slow, dreamlike. No one stopped her. Why would they? She was just clearing the remains of the meal, performing her duties, being a good house slave. Her hand closed around the handle of the carving fork. The silver was warm from sitting near the candles. The weight of it was substantial, real. She could feel every detail, the ornate scrollwork on the handle, the slight roughness where the tines met the shaft, the perfect balance of the thing. A tool. Just a tool. Meant for carving meat, for serving food, for the civilized rituals of dining. But tools could be repurposed. A knife could cut bread or cut flesh. A fork could spear lamb or spear eyes. She turned, the fork concealed in the folds of her apron. Whitmore was laughing at something Beauregard had said, his head thrown back, his throat exposed, his pale eyes squeezed shut with mirth. Those eyes. Those watery blue eyes that looked at Temperance with ownership, that had watched Marcus being led away in chains, that had supervised countless whippings and brutalities. Eyes that saw black bodies as property, as objects, as things to be used and discarded. Delphine stood behind her sister. She reached out with her free hand and placed it on Temperance's shoulder, a touch meant to comfort, to reassure, to say goodbye. Temperance turned, her face wet with silent tears. "Delphine," she whispered, her voice breaking on the name. "Shoo," Delphine said softly. "It's going to be all right." It was a lie. Nothing was going to be all right. But some lies were necessary, final kindnesses before the end. She looked past Temperance, across the dining room to where Cyrus Whitmore sat, his guard down, his body loose with drink and satisfaction. The distance between them was perhaps 10 feet. 10 feet and a lifetime of accumulated rage. 10 feet and 28 years of swallowed screams. 10 feet and a tomb full of the dead who demanded witness, who demanded remembrance, who demanded something more than passive survival. The carving fork was warm in her hand. The candles flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily toward 8 o'clock. And Delphine understood, with perfect clarity, that she was about to cross a line from which there was no return. That the next moments would define the rest of her life, however long or short that life might be. That she was choosing violence, choosing destruction, choosing to become the very thing that white people feared most, a slave who refused to accept her bondage, who struck back against her oppressors, who took the tools of civilization and turned them into weapons of vengeance. She was choosing to be remembered rather than to survive. She was choosing to be seen. And if seeing meant destroying, if being human meant becoming monstrous, if justice meant blood and horror and violation answered with violation, then so be it. Let them fear her. Let them remember her. Let her become the nightmare they whispered about, the cautionary tale, the proof that cruelty breeds cruelty and violence begets violence. Let Temperance live in a world where Cyrus Whitmore could never touch her again. Delphine's fingers tightened on the fork. She took a step forward. Then another. Whitmore's laughter filled the room, oblivious and obscene. The tomb inside Delphine's chest split open completely, and what poured out was not grief but something sharper, something that had teeth and claws and no mercy left inside it. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice steady. He turned to look at her, his face still split in that yellow-toothed smile. She smiled back. And moved. Time fractured. The world became a series of crystalline moments, each one sharp and distinct, separated from the next by vast gulfs of compressed eternity. Delphine saw everything with terrible clarity, the pattern of light reflecting off the wine glasses, the way dust motes hung suspended in the candle glow, the exact angle of Whitmore's jaw as he turned toward her voice. She crossed the distance between them in 3 steps. 1. 2. 3. Her left hand came up and clamped over his forehead, fingers digging into the damp skin above his eyebrows. His skull was hot beneath her palm, slick with sweat. She jerked his head back with all the strength accumulated from 8 years of beating rugs and scrubbing floors and carrying water, from a lifetime of labor that had carved iron into her muscles. Whitmore's body went rigid with shock. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged yet, only a gasp of surprise, the intake of breath before the scream. His hands came up reflexively, grasping at her wrist, but she had surprise and leverage and 28 years of rage propelling her forward. Her right hand moved. The carving fork, concealed until this moment, rose in a silver arc. The first tine entered his left eye just off-center, puncturing the sclera with a sound like a boot stepping into mud, wet and soft and obscenely organic. The resistance was less than she expected. The eye was not a solid thing but a vessel, a membrane stretched over liquid, and the fork slid through it with horrible ease. Whitmore's scream tore through the dining room. It was not a human sound. It was something primal, animal, a shriek of pure agony that seemed to come from the base of his spine. His body convulsed, his hands clawing at Delphine's arm, his legs kicking against the table. The china rattled. A wine glass tipped and fell, red liquid spreading across the white tablecloth like arterial spray. But Delphine did not stop. Could not stop. The momentum of the act carried her forward, and something deeper than momentum, some fundamental shift in her understanding of herself, of what she was capable of what survival could mean when it was no longer passive but active, violent, choosing. She wrenched the fork free. Vitreous fluid gushed from the ruined socket, clear and viscous, running down Whitmore's cheek like tears. His head thrashed in her grip, but she held fast, her hand of ice on his skull. Blood followed the fluid, darker, pulsing from the damaged vessels behind the eye. The dining room exploded into chaos. Constance Blackwood's scream joined Whitmore's, higher, thinner, the sound of a woman whose carefully constructed illusions were shattering before her. She stumbled backward from the table, her chair clattering to the floor behind her. Master Blackwood surged to his feet, his brandy snifter falling from his fingers to shatter on the floor. "Stop her!" His voice cracked with panic and outrage. "Someone stop her!" But no one moved fast enough. Shock had frozen them all in their places, Beauregard half risen from his chair, his young face slack with horror, old Josiah in the doorway, his ancient eyes wide, Temperance still by the sideboard, one hand pressed to her mouth. Delphine adjusted her grip, angling the fork toward Whitmore's right eye. He saw it coming. She saw him see it, saw the awareness bloom in his remaining eye, that pale blue iris that had looked at her sister with ownership, at Marcus with contempt, at hundreds of suffering bodies with indifference. She saw understanding arrive, saw him grasp that this was not a momentary madness but a deliberate act, that she meant to complete what she had started, that she was going to take both eyes, leave him in darkness, blind him as he had blinded so many others to suffering and humanity. "No," the word bubbled from his throat, distorted by pain and terror. "Please. Please." The word he had heard hundreds of times from the people he tortured, the pleas he had ignored with casual cruelty. The word that meant nothing when spoken by someone you did not see as human. The fork descended. The second tine took his right eye at the inner corner, sliding in alongside the bridge of his nose. This time she felt more resistance, perhaps she had struck the bony orbit, perhaps his struggling had changed the angle, but she drove the tine deeper, twisting slightly, and then there was a terrible giving way, a puncturing pop that she felt through the silver handle. Whitmore's scream reached a pitch that should not have been possible. His entire body arched backward, spine bowing, every muscle going rigid with agony. His hands found the fork handle and tried to pull it away, but his fingers were slippery with blood and fluid, sliding uselessly against the silver. Delphine released his forehead and stepped back, leaving the fork embedded in his face. For a moment, she stood there looking at her work. The overseer sat in his chair, head thrown back, both eye sockets now weeping blood and clear fluid and darker matter that might have been tissue from deeper inside. The fork protruded from his right eye, its ornate handle catching the candlelight grotesquely. His mouth was open in a continuous scream that had gone ragged, hoarse, breaking into sobs and gasps. His hands scrabbled at his face, trying to assess the damage, but every touch brought fresh waves of pain. Blood ran down his cheeks, into his mouth, staining his collar and vest. He was making sounds now that had no shape, keening, animal noises of incomprehension and suffering. He could not see. Would never see again. The eyes that had watched atrocities with satisfaction, that had lingered on Temperance's body with proprietorial hunger, that had looked at black people as property to be managed, those eyes were gone, destroyed, reduced to ruined meat. Master Blackwood finally unfroze. He lunged toward Delphine, his gentleman's hands reaching for her shoulders, but she moved with a grace she had never known she possessed. Her body was no longer her own, it belonged to something older, something that predated language and civilization, something that knew only survival and vengeance. She spun away from his grasp and her hand found the carving knife on the serving cart. The blade was 8 inches long, honed to razor sharpness for cutting through lamb and beef. It fit her hand as if made for it. "Stay back," she said, and her voice was not her own. It was too calm, too cold, too absolute. "All of you stay back." Master Blackwood froze mid-lunge, his eyes fixed on the knife. Beauregard had pressed himself against the far wall, his face gone white as bone. Constance was still screaming, though her voice had gone thin and breathless, more air than sound. Whitmore had managed to grasp the fork handle. He pulled, and Delphine heard the wet sucking sound as the tines withdrew from the socket. The fork clattered to the floor, covered in blood and worse things. He collapsed forward, his hands cupping his ruined face, blood pouring between his fingers. His chair tipped, and he went down with it, sprawling on the Persian rug. He was still screaming, but the sound had changed. It was weaker now, shocked, the screams of a man whose body was shutting down from trauma and pain. He writhed on the floor like something freshly killed, not quite dead but no longer fully alive, existing in that terrible space between. Delphine stood over him, the knife in her hand. She could finish it. One quick slash across the throat, and Cyrus Whitmore would bleed out on the floor of this fine dining room, would die surrounded by the trappings of civilization that had never civilized him at all. But she did not cut his throat. She wanted him to live. Wanted him to wake every morning in darkness, to feel his way through the world blind and helpless, to know vulnerability and dependence and fear. She wanted his existence to become the hell he had created for others. Death would be mercy, and she had no mercy left to give. Blood was everywhere. It had sprayed across the white tablecloth in arterial patterns, had pooled on the floor around Whitmore's convulsing form, had speckled the wallpaper and the portrait of Master Blackwood's father and the silver candlesticks. The smell of it filled the room, copper and salt and something darker, more organic. Delphine's dress was saturated with it. Her hands were red to the wrists. She could feel it drying on her face where it had sprayed, tightening her skin. She looked down at herself and saw not a house slave but something else entirely. Something that had emerged from the tomb inside her chest, born from accumulated grief and rage, covered in the blood of her oppressor. She felt nothing. No satisfaction, no horror, no regret. Just a vast emptiness where emotion should have been, a space hollowed out by years of forced silence and witnessing. She had become the violence done to her. Had transformed suffering into action. Had chosen to be remembered rather than to survive. Temperance was crying. Delphine could hear her sister's sobs cutting through Whitmore's weakening screams and Constance's breathless hysteria. She turned to look at Temperance, and their eyes met across the blood-spattered dining room. In her sister's face, Delphine saw not gratitude but terror. Temperance was looking at her as if at a stranger, as if the woman who had raised her and protected her had been replaced by something monstrous and unknowable. And perhaps she had been. Perhaps the person Delphine had died the moment that fork entered Whitmore's eye, and what remained was something new, something born in violence, baptized in blood. "He won't hurt you now," Delphine said, and her voice was still that stranger's voice, calm, cold, certain. "He won't hurt anyone." Master Blackwood had recovered some of his composure. He stood with his back to the wall, his face flushed with rage and fear. "You're dead," he said, his voice shaking. "Do you understand that? You're dead. I'll see you hanged, burned alive, torn apart." "Yes," Delphine interrupted. "I know." And she did know. The moment she had driven that first tine into Whitmore's eye, she had sealed her own fate. There was no scenario in which she walked away from this act. The laws that governed this world, the entire structure of slavery and ownership, demanded her destruction. A slave who struck a white person, who injured them, who dared to resist, such a slave could not be permitted to exist. Her death was required, necessary, inevitable. But Temperance would live. Temperance would not be sold to Cyrus Whitmore, would not be trapped in his quarters, would not endure the slow death of spirit that awaited her. Whatever else happened, Delphine had prevented that. It was enough. It had to be enough. Whitmore had stopped screaming. He lay on the floor now, curled on his side, his hands still pressed to his face, making small wounded sounds like a child. Blood continued to seep between his fingers, pooling on the rug beneath his head. His breathing was shallow, rapid, the breathing of a body in shock. Old Josiah finally moved from the doorway. He approached slowly, his hands held out in a gesture of peace, of non-threat. "Miss Delphine," he said softly, using the honorific that slaves gave each other but which white folks never used, "you need to put down that knife now." "Why?" Delphine asked, genuinely curious. What difference did it make whether she held the knife or not? The damage was done. The line was crossed. The world had changed utterly, and holding or not holding a knife could not change it back. "Because young Master Beauregard's about to fetch the sheriff," Josiah said, his voice still gentle, still trying to reach the person she had been. "And when the sheriff comes, it'll go easier on you if you ain't armed." Easier. The word was laughable. There was no easy in what awaited her. But Josiah was old and kind, and he was trying to help in the only way he knew how. Delphine looked at the knife in her hand. The blade was clean, she had not cut Whitmore's throat after all, had chosen the more terrible mercy of leaving him alive. She set it down on the table beside the ruined supper, the blood-soaked tablecloth, the overturned glasses and scattered silver. Her hands were shaking now. She had not noticed when they started, but now she could not make them stop. The tremor traveled up her arms, into her shoulders, until her entire body was shaking. Not with fear, she was beyond fear, but with the sheer physical aftermath of violence, the body's response to adrenaline and exertion and the fundamental transformation of self. She had killed something tonight. Not just Whitmore's eyes, but something inside herself, the part that believed in survival through submission, that counseled patience and endurance, that whispered that tomorrow might be better if only she could last until tomorrow. That part was dead. And she had no idea what would grow in its place. Footsteps thundered on the stairs. Beauregard, running to fetch help. Running to set in motion the machinery of retribution that would grind her into dust. Constance had stopped screaming. She sat in a heap against the wall, her dove-gray silk crumpled around her, her face buried in her hands. She was rocking slightly, back and forth, making small sounds of distress. Master Blackwood had not moved from his position by the wall. He stared at Delphine with an expression she could not quite read, horror, yes, and rage, but something else beneath. Something that might have been fear. Not fear of her, precisely, but fear of what she represented. If one slave could break the bonds of submission, could strike back, could choose violence over survival, then all slaves might. The entire structure that held his world together might fracture. She was not just an individual criminal but a crack in the foundation, proof that the system was not as stable as he had believed. Whitmore groaned, a wet, bubbling sound. He was trying to speak, his lips moving, but only incomprehensible sounds emerged. His ruined face turned toward where Delphine stood, sightless sockets seeking her, and she felt a strange pity stir beneath the emptiness. He was just a man, after all. A terrible man, a cruel man, a man who had inflicted unspeakable suffering, but still just a man, broken and bleeding on a dining room floor. The violence had not ennobled either of them. It had simply revealed what human beings could become when pushed past the edge of endurance. Temperance crossed the room. She moved slowly, as if walking through water, and came to stand beside Delphine. She did not touch her sister, but her presence was a solid thing, a statement. When the sheriff came, when the judgment fell, Temperance would stand witness. Would remember. Would carry forward the story of this night. "I'm sorry," Delphine whispered, though she was not sure what she was apologizing for. For the horror of what Temperance had witnessed. For the violence that had been necessary to protect her. For the fact that they had been born into a world where such choices became inevitable. Temperance said nothing. But she reached out and took Delphine's blood-covered hand in her own, and they stood together in the ruins of the Sunday supper, waiting for whatever came next. Time moved strangely in the aftermath. Seconds stretched into hours, and hours compressed into heartbeats. Delphine stood in the center of the dining room, Temperance's hand still clasped in hers, and watched the world rearrange itself around the violence she had committed. The candles continued to burn, indifferent to the blood on the floors and walls. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily toward 9 o'clock. Outside, cicadas sang their evening song, a sound so normal it seemed obscene. Cyrus Whitmore had gone quiet. He lay on his side in a spreading pool of blood and other fluids, his breathing shallow and irregular, his hand still cupped over the ruins of his face. Every few seconds, a tremor would run through his body, some involuntary spasm of shock and trauma. His lips moved soundlessly, forming words that had no voice. Perhaps he was praying. Perhaps he was simply trying to understand what had happened to him, how the world had inverted so completely that he, the overseer, the authority, the wielder of whips and judgment, had become the victim. Constance Blackwood had collapsed entirely. She sat with her back against the wall, her fine silk dress pooled around her like a puddle of dirty water. Her hands had fallen from her face, and she stared at nothing with eyes that had gone glassy and vacant. Shock, Delphine thought distantly. The mistress had retreated into that safe space where the mind goes when reality becomes unbearable. How many times had Delphine herself gone to that place? How many times had she felt her consciousness fracture, part of her enduring while another part fled to some interior room where pain could not reach? Master Blackwood remained pressed against the wall, his gentleman's posture abandoned, his carefully cultivated authority shattered like the wine glasses scattered across the floor. He was breathing hard through his nose, his chest rising and falling rapidly, and his eyes never left Delphine. She could see the calculations happening behind his rage, what to do, how to proceed, how to reassert control over a situation that had spun so wildly beyond his management. "You'll hang for this," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "You understand that? They'll make an example of you. Every slave in Mississippi will see what happens to those who raise their hand against their owners." Delphine finished for him, her voice still carrying that eerie calm. "Against their masters. Against the men who buy and sell them like livestock. Master Blackwood's face flushed darker. You are property. You have no right. No, Delphine interrupted. I'm not property. I was never property. You wrote words on paper and called it ownership, but you can't own a person. You can only break them, and I'm done being broken. The words hung in the air between them, a declaration and an epitaph. Master Blackwood opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the door burst open. Beauregard stumbled back into the room, followed by 3 other men. Samuel, the young stable hand, barely 17, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. Ruth, the cook, a heavy-set woman of 50 whose face had gone ashen at the sight of the carnage. And old Josiah, moving slowly but with purpose, his ancient face carved into deep lines of sorrow and understanding. They stopped just inside the doorway, taking in the scene. The blood. The overturned furniture. Whitmore's prone form. Delphine standing in the center of it all, her dress saturated red, her hands still dripping. Ruth made a sound low in her throat, not quite a moan, not quite a prayer. Samuel took a step backward, his hand coming up to cover his mouth. But old Josiah's eyes found Delphine's, and in them she saw no judgment. Only a terrible, infinite sadness. He had seen this before, his expression said. I had seen the moment when submission became impossible, when the weight of witnessing grew too heavy to bear, when the only choice left was violence or death. He had probably felt it himself, decades ago, and had chosen differently. Had chosen to survive, to endure, to carry his rage quietly to the grave. Neither choice was wrong. Neither choice was right. They were simply the options available to people who should never have had to make such choices at all. Lord have mercy, Ruth whispered, her hand moving to clutch the cross that hung around her neck. Lord have mercy on us all. There will be no mercy, Master Blackwood snapped, finding his voice again. Samuel, run to town. Fetch Sheriff Calhoun. Tell him we have an emergency, a slave has attacked Mr. Whitmore. Tell him to bring men. Armed men. Samuel hesitated, his eyes still fixed on Whitmore's bleeding form. The overseer had been a figure of terror in his life, the man who controlled every aspect of existence in the fields, who decided who ate and who went hungry, who lived and who was sold away. To see him reduced to this, broken, blind, helpless, was to see the foundations of the world crack open. Boy! Master Blackwood's voice cracked like a whip. Did you hear me? Go. Now. Samuel fled, his footsteps echoing through the house and then fading into the night beyond. The silence that followed was broken only by Whitmore's labored breathing and the soft, continuous drip of blood falling from the table edge to the floor. Drip. 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 A metronome counting down the minutes until judgment arrived. Ruth moved first. She crossed the room slowly, giving Delphine a wide berth, and knelt beside Whitmore. Her hands hovered over his body, uncertain where to touch, how to help. Finally, she pulled a clean napkin from the sideboard and pressed it gently to his face, trying to stanch the bleeding. Whitmore flinched at her touch and made a sound, a whimper, really, the sound of a wounded animal. His hands clutched at Ruth's apron, seeking comfort or simply contact, proof that he still existed in the world even though the world had gone dark. Easy now, Ruth murmured, her voice falling into the practiced gentleness she used when tending the sick. Easy. You're going to be all right. It was a lie. They all knew it. Even if Whitmore survived, and he might, the wounds were horrific but not immediately fatal, he would never be all right again. His eyes were gone, destroyed beyond any hope of healing. He would live the rest of his life in darkness, dependent on others for the most basic tasks, a burden rather than an authority. For a man like Cyrus Whitmore, that might be worse than death. Delphine watched Ruth tend to him and felt a strange disconnection from the scene. That was her work, that broken body, that suffering. She had done that. Her hands had driven steel into flesh, had destroyed eyes, and had transformed a man into a ruin. And she felt, what? Not pride, exactly. Not satisfied. Just a hollow certainty that it had been necessary, that given the same circumstances she would do it again, that this was the only response available to the question that Whitmore's existence had posed. Why? The voice was small, broken. Master Blackwood's son had finally found the courage to speak. Beauregard stood near the doorway, his face still pale, his hands trembling. Why would you do this? Father treats you well. You have a good position here, better than the field hands. You could have. Could you have what? Delphine turned to look at the boy, and something in her gaze made him flinch. Could have watched while he took my sister. Could have stood by while he broke her the way he's broken dozens of others. Could have added her screams to all the screams I carry inside me. She's just, Beauregard stopped himself, but they all knew what he had been about to say. Just a slave. Just property. Just something that could be used and discarded without consequence. She's my sister, Delphine said quietly. She's 16 years old. She likes to sing while she works. She's afraid of thunderstorms. She cries when she sees baby birds that have fallen from their nests. She's a person, and he was going to destroy her. Beauregard had no response to that. How could he? In his world, in the world he was being raised to inherit, none of those details mattered. Temperance's humanity was irrelevant to the question of her use. She was valuable only insofar as she could labor, and if her labor included submitting to Whitmore's desires, then that was simply the natural order of things. But the natural order was not natural at all. It was constructed, maintained through violence and law and the constant reinforcement of lies about who was human and who was not. And Delphine had just revealed those lies for what they were. Had shown, with silver tines and blood, that the people they called property had hands that could grip weapons, had rage that could overflow into action, had reached limits beyond which they would not be pushed. Old Josiah had moved to stand near Delphine, not touching her but close enough that his presence was a solid thing. Child, he said softly, what you done here tonight? It changes everything. You know that? I know. They'll come with ropes and torches. Maybe they'll burn the whole quarters down, make sure no one else gets ideas. Delphine's stomach clenched. She had not thought beyond the act itself, beyond the immediate necessity of stopping Whitmore. But of course there would be consequences that extended beyond her own death. The white folks would be frightened now, would see rebellion in every slave's eyes, would respond with overwhelming violence to restore the fear that kept the system functioning. I'm sorry, she whispered, and this time she knew exactly what she was apologizing for. For the suffering her action would cause others. For the inevitable retribution. For breaking the fragile, horrible peace that had allowed them all to survive day by day. Don't be sorry, Josiah said, and there was something like pride in his ancient voice. Someone had to say no. Someone had to show them we ain't just what they made us. You did that. Whatever comes next, you did that. Temperance's hand tightened in Delphine's. I won't let them take you, she said, her voice fierce despite the tears still streaming down her face. I'll tell them it was me. I'll say I did it. No. Delphine turned to her sister, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time, not as the child she had protected, but as a young woman with her own strength, her own capacity for sacrifice. No, you won't. You're going to live, Temperance. You're going to survive. You're going to remember this, remember me, remember all of us. That's your burden now. To carry the memory forward. Delphine. Promise me. Temperance sobbed, but she nodded. I promise. Ruth had managed to stop the worst of Whitmore's bleeding. The napkin pressed to his face was soaked through, but the flow had slowed to a seep. His breathing had steadied somewhat, though it still rattled in his chest. He had stopped trying to speak, had retreated into some interior space where pain was manageable only through complete withdrawal. He needs a doctor, Ruth said, looking up at Master Blackwood. These wounds, if they fester, the infection will kill him. Samuel will bring Dr. Morrison with the sheriff, Master Blackwood replied, his voice still tight with controlled rage. Though I'm not certain the effort is worthwhile. A blind overseer is of no use to anyone. The casual cruelty of the statement, the immediate calculation of Whitmore's continued value, might have shocked Delphine once. Now it simply confirmed what she had always known, in this world, everyone was only as valuable as their utility. Once that utility ended, so did concern for their welfare. Whitmore had made himself useful through violence and intimidation. Without his sight, without his ability to oversee and discipline, he was just another mouth to feed, another problem to be managed. They all waited. The clock ticked. The candles burned lower. Outside, night had fully fallen, and through the windows, Delphine could see fireflies blinking in the darkness like distant stars. The world continued, indifferent to the small tragedy playing out within these walls. Constance Blackwood had begun to rock again, her arms wrapped around herself, humming something low and tuneless. The sound was eerie, childlike, the humming of a mind that had broken free of its moorings. Master Blackwood glanced at his wife, and something flickered across his face, concern. Irritation. It was hard to say. He made no move to comfort her. Beauregard had retreated to the far corner of the room, as if distance might protect him from contamination. He watched everything with wide eyes, absorbing lessons he had not expected to learn. This night would shape him, Delphine thought. Would either harden him into an even crueler master than his father, or, unlikely but possible, plant seeds of doubt about the world he was inheriting. More likely the former. People rarely learned the lessons that required them to question their own power. Footsteps on the porch. Voices. The heavy tread of boots. Samuel had returned, and he had not come alone. The door swung open, and Sheriff Calhoun entered, flanked by 2 deputies. The sheriff was a portly man in his 50s, with a face like raw dough and small, suspicious eyes. He wore his authority like ill-fitting clothing, obvious, uncomfortable, constantly in need of adjustment. Behind him came Dr. Morrison, a thin man with nervous hands who clutched his medical bag like a talisman. Sheriff Calhoun's eyes swept the room, taking in the blood, the overturned furniture, Whitmore's prone form, and finally Delphine standing in the center of it all. His face hardened. "Well," he said, his voice carrying the lazy drawl of a man who had never questioned his right to judge others. "This is quite a mess you've made, girl. Girl. Not a woman, not a person. Just girl, diminished, infantilized, reduced." It was automatic, reflexive, the language of dismissal that maintained hierarchies without thought. Delphine said nothing. What was there to say? The evidence was written in blood across the walls and floor. No words could change what had happened, could undo the violence or restore what had been broken. "Someone wants to tell me what happened here?" Sheriff Calhoun continued, looking at Master Blackwood. "My house slave attacked Mr. Whitmore," Master Blackwood said, his voice clipped and precise. "Without provocation. Without warning. She destroyed his eyes with a carving fork." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was heavy with implication. "He was a guest in my home. At my table. And she violated every law of God and man. Without provocation." The lie hung in the air, so obvious that even the sheriff's eyebrows rose slightly. But he would not question it. To question it would be to question the entire system, to suggest that slaves might have reasons for violence, might be responding to provocations that white men simply refused to see. Dr. Morrison had hurried to Whitmore's side, kneeling beside Ruth. He lifted the blood-soaked napkin and hissed through his teeth at what he saw beneath. "Sweet Jesus," he muttered. "Both eyes?" "Both," Ruth confirmed quietly. The doctor opened his bag and began extracting instruments and bandages, his movements efficient despite the tremor in his hands. "We need to get him to my surgery. These wounds need proper cleaning. I'll have to remove what remains of the eyes, pack the sockets, pray that infection doesn't set in. Even then." He trailed off, the prognosis clear. Sheriff Calhoun turned his attention back to Delphine. "You got anything to say for yourself, girl?" Delphine met his eyes. She could lie. Could claim madness, temporary insanity, could play the role of the crazed Negro that white folks expected. It might buy her a quick death instead of a slow one, a hanging instead of burning. But she was done lying. Done diminishing herself. Done playing roles written by people who refused to see her humanity. "He was going to take my sister," she said clearly. "He was going to buy her and use her and break her. I stopped him. That's all. That's all." The sheriff's voice rose with indignation. "You destroyed a white man's eyes, and you say, that's all?" "Yes." The simplicity of her answer seemed to enrage him more than defiance would have. He took a step toward her, one hand moving to the pistol at his belt. "You got any idea what we do to slaves who attack white folks?" "I imagine I'll find out soon enough." Old Josiah stirred beside her. "Sheriff," he said carefully, "the girl ain't armed. Ain't resisting. Might be you could show some restraint in. You keep your mouth shut, old man, unless you want to join her. The sheriff's hand was on his pistol now, fingers curling around the grip. I've dealt with uppity slaves before. Know exactly how to handle them. John. Dr. Morrison's voice cut through the tension. We need to move Whitmore. Now. He's going into shock. If we don't get him stabilized, he'll die right here on this floor. Sheriff Calhoun hesitated, torn between immediate violence and practical necessity. Finally, he nodded curtly to his deputies. Get him to the doc's surgery. And you, he pointed at Delphine. You come with me. Thompson, get the irons. One of the deputies produced a set of iron shackles from his belt. The metal was cold as it closed around Delphine's wrists, heavy with the weight of all the captivity it represented. The chains rattled as her hands were pulled in front of her, locked together with a solid click that sounded like a door closing. Temperance made a sound of protest, but Delphine shook her head slightly. Remember your promise, she said softly. Her sister nodded, tears streaming down her face, her hand coming up to press against her mouth as if to hold in the sobs that threatened to break free. The deputies lifted Whitmore as carefully as they could, but even so, he groaned with pain at the movement. Blood had soaked through the bandages Dr. Morrison had hastily applied. They carried him toward the door, and his head lolled to the side, his ruined face turning blindly toward where Delphine stood. She looked at him, really looked, and felt nothing but a vast emptiness where rage had been. The act was done. The violence was complete. What remained was only consequence. Sheriff Calhoun's hand closed around her upper arm, his grip tight enough to bruise. Come on, girl. You got a cell waiting for you. Delphine allowed herself to be pulled toward the door. As she passed old Josiah, he reached out and touched her shoulder briefly, a benediction or a farewell or simply an acknowledgement of witness. Ruth had closed her eyes and was praying, her lips moving silently. Even Master Blackwood had gone quiet, watching her departure with an expression that might have been satisfaction or might have been unease. At the threshold, Delphine turned back to look at the dining room one last time. The Sunday supper table with its blood-stained cloth. The overturned chairs and shattered glass. The portrait of Master Blackwood's father staring down with painted disapproval. The room that had been the site of so many forced smiles and swallowed rage and careful servility. She would never see it again. Never stand behind the master's chair with the palmetto fan, never count the seconds until release, never watch white faces gorge themselves on food prepared by black hands. That version of herself was dead. What remained would face whatever came next, the cell, the trial, the rope or the fire, with the same hollow certainty that had guided her hand tonight. She had chosen to be seen. To be remembered. To say no. Whatever the cost, it was worth it. The sheriff dragged her through the door and into the night beyond, where torches were already being lit, where whispers were already spreading, where the machinery of retribution was already beginning to grind forward. Behind her, Temperance stood in the doorway and watched her sister disappear into the darkness, carrying with her the burden of memory and the weight of a promise made. The cellar was older than the house itself, carved from red Mississippi clay and shored up with timber that had begun to rot decades ago. It smelled of earth and mildew and something else, the accumulated despair of everyone who had been locked in this darkness before. Delphine sat on the dirt floor, her back against the stone wall, the iron shackles heavy on her wrists. A single lamp burned near the door at the top of the stairs, throwing weak light that barely reached her. Hours had passed. Or perhaps only minutes. Time had lost meaning. Above, she could hear them, boots on floorboards, voices rising and falling in argument. The sheriff had returned from town with more men. She had heard horses, the jangle of bridles, the low murmur of a gathering crowd. Word was spreading. By morning, half the county would know what the house slave at Blackwood Plantation had done. The cellar door opened. Lamplight spilled down the stairs, and Temperance descended, carrying a tin cup of water. Behind her, Sheriff Calhoun's silhouette filled the doorway. 5 minutes, he called down. Then she goes back up. They're deciding what to do with her. Temperance knelt beside Delphine and held the cup to her lips. The water was cool, clean. Delphine drank deeply, tasting metal and mercy in equal measure. They're talking about hanging you at dawn, Temperance whispered, her voice breaking. Some want worse. I want to make an example. Whitmore's still alive, Dr. Morrison says he might survive, but he'll never see again. Good. The word came out flat, certain. Temperance's hand found Delphine's, threading their fingers together despite the chains. Master Blackwood is afraid. I can see it in his face. They all are. The other slaves are watching, waiting. Ruth says some of the field hands are talking, not rebellion, not yet, but something's changed. You changed it. I didn't mean to start anything. I just meant to stop him. I know. Temperance's tears fell onto their joined hands. But you did both. Through the small window near the ceiling, Delphine could see a sliver of night sky. Stars visible between the bars. She had been born under those stars, had lived her entire life beneath them, and would die under them soon. The thought brought neither comfort nor fear. Just acceptance. When I'm gone, Delphine said quietly, you keep your head down. Don't give them any reason. Survive, Temperance. That's all I ask. Survive and remember. I'll remember. Temperance pressed her forehead against Delphine's shoulder. I'll remember everything. Your name. What you did. Why did you do it? I'll tell my children, and they'll tell theirs. You won't be forgotten. That was all anyone could ask for, really. To be remembered. To have their story carried forward by those who came after. Not as a cautionary tale or a monster, but as a person who had reached their limit and chosen to act. Footsteps on the stairs. Sheriff Calhoun's voice, time's up, girl. Back upstairs. Temperance kissed Delphine's cheek, tasting salt and blood still dried there. I love you, she whispered. I love you too. Now go. Keep your promise. Temperance climbed the stairs, her back straight despite the tears, and Delphine was alone again in the darkness. More hours. Voices above grow louder, more agitated. Delphine could make out individual words now, example. Discipline. Hang her. Burn her. The words floated down through the floorboards like ash from a distant fire. She thought of Marcus, wondering if news of this night would reach him somehow in Louisiana. I wondered if he would understand. She thought of her mother, sold away when Delphine was 10, disappeared into the vast machinery of slavery, her fate unknown. She thought of all the others, the children torn from mother's arms, the men broken on the wheel of forced labor, the women used and discarded. She thought of Cyrus Whitmore's eyes, the soft resistance before the puncture, the hot blood on her hands. She felt nothing. No regret, no satisfaction. Just the hollow certainty that she had done what needed doing. The cellar door opened again. This time it was not Temperance who descended but Sheriff Calhoun himself, flanked by 2 deputies. His face was grim. Get up, he said. Delphine stood, her legs stiff from sitting on cold ground. The chains rattled as she moved. Master Blackwood's decided, the sheriff continued. You're to hang at dawn. Public execution in the town square. Every slave within 10 miles will be required to witness. He paused, studying her face as if looking for fear. You got anything to say? Any last words before we take you to the gallows? Delphine looked at him, this man who enforced laws designed to keep people in chains, who saw justice only through the lens of white supremacy, who would sleep soundly after watching her die. Tell them, she said clearly, that I took his eyes so he could never look at my sister again. Tell them I'm not sorry. Tell them that every slave who sees me hang will remember that even property can bite back. The sheriff's face darkened. You're a fool, girl. You threw your life away for nothing. Whitmore survives. Your sister will just be sold to someone else. Nothing you did matters. You're wrong. Delphine smiled, and it was not a kind smile. Everything I did matters. You're afraid, all of you. I can see it. You're wondering how many others are standing behind their masters' chairs right now, looking at the carving knives, counting the cost. That fear. That's what I bought with Whitmore's eyes. That's what matters. Sheriff Calhoun grabbed her arm roughly. Move. They climbed the stairs, and Delphine emerged into the lamplight. The house was full of white men, planters from neighboring properties, the town magistrate, a minister clutching his Bible. They all turned to stare at her as she passed, their faces a mixture of fear and fascination and barely concealed bloodlust. She walked with her head high. Outside, dawn was breaking. Pink light touched the eastern sky. Her last sunrise. Delphine looked at it and smiled. This dark chapter of history reminds us that horror often grows from real atrocities. If this story unsettled and moved you, subscribe for more tales from history's darkest corners. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on Delphine's desperate act. Was it justice, madness, or both? The gallows awaited her at dawn, but her story would live forever in whispered memory, a ghost that haunted every Sunday supper table, every master's uneasy sleep, every moment when the oppressed dared to imagine freedom bought with blood.